Coming up, we explore if Iran is headed towards regime change or another round of conflict with Israel. And we get perspective from a released IDF soldier on war, loss, and the day after Gaza. This is The Deep Dive. Welcome back to The Deep Dive. I'm your host, Jacob Laznik. Well, a lot of news to go over this week, but the main story has to be Iran. Currently stuck in the middle between internal protests and renewed dialogue of another conflict with Israel, the regime is really feeling the pressure. To discuss this more, we're joined by Israel's international spokesperson to the UN, Jonathan Harounoff. Welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So can you first, I'd say, start by introducing yourself, letting our viewers know who you are?
Sure. My name's Jonathan Harounoff, born and raised in London, living in the United States for the past 9 years. Journalist, media person by training, and now I currently serve as Israel's international spokesperson at the United Nations.
Amazing. And we brought you on here to talk about Iran. So could you shed some light on your experience on reporting on Iran and your knowledge on Iran?
Absolutely. So my family comes from the region. My grandparents on both sides are Iranian, so I grew up surrounded by news, and my mum is Israeli, so news about Israel, Iran, Persian language and culture, Israeli language and culture, and the tensions, and of course the beautiful history of collaboration that exists between the two. But in a professional capacity, I spent about 7 years covering Iran and Israel and the broader Middle East for a variety of publications, including the Jerusalem Post and the New York Post and a few other places. And earlier this year, I published a book called Unveiled Inside Iran's Woman Life Freedom Revolt, about the Islamic Republic's essentially 46-year war on women and the Iranian people's continuous quest for freedom. And the book specifically focuses on the transformative protest that took place in 2022 after the killing of a young Iranian Kurdish woman, Mahsa Jina Amini. So the book traces the origins of that revolt, its successes, its shortcomings, and also its legacy, and how future protests and uprisings are inevitable, which is very fitting for the conversation we're having, because we're seeing another cycle of unrest, and it's certainly not something that just came out of the blue. It's a result of mounting resentment towards a regime that really doesn't care about its own people.
So first, I want to kind of set like a baseline. If somebody is watching this and they haven't necessarily been keeping up with the news, before I go into the history and the waves of protests and how this isn't just one isolated incident, can you give us like a kind of like a baseline of what's currently happening right now about this new wave of protests, when it started, who's taking part, et cetera, et cetera?
Absolutely. So earlier this week, we started seeing reports of shopkeepers, store owners, bazaar owners, mostly in Tehran, staging protests. And that's usually a very dangerous sign for the regime, and because they're essentially the lifeblood of the local economy, and they're also essentially harbingers of things that are likely to come. So we started seeing people shuttering their stores, reportedly because of the Iranian currency plummeting significantly to a historic low, and the inflation really rising up to dizzying heights of around 42%. But I think some mainstream media outlets imply that was like the sole reason that people were revolting. But the truth is much more complex, and what we were discussing recently, that there's a whole cauldron of issues that people are protesting against, whether it's economic miseries, the lack of social rights, the subjugation of women and minority rights, the brutality, the violence, the fact that there are chronic water shortages, gas and electricity shortages. So what we're seeing now is just continued every day, more and more people rising up, and the protests spreading not outside of Tehran to cities like Isfahan, Shiraz, Mashhad, and many other provinces. And as of the time of recording, Wednesday, December 31st, as many as the protests have reached as many as 10 of Iran's 31 provinces. And if history is any guide, these things usually, spread very quickly, and simultaneously, the regime, which of course has been weakened significantly by the US and Israel, tends to launch, a campaign of repression to stamp it out, and mass arrests, and unfortunately we're likely to see some violence. But what you can be equally guaranteed of is the fact that the people of Iran won't stop until they reach freedom, and that they're extraordinarily defiant. And I think one other thing that really helped sort of globalize this particular uprising is the striking image that we saw of a man who was sitting cross-legged, head crouched in the middle of the street, as looking down, sort of undisturbed, as a whole sort of army of regime security forces on motorcycles were approaching him and eventually detained him. And so that, I think it was that striking image that also bore a lot of parallels to what happened in Tiananmen Square. And I believe one of your editors, Alex Winston, put out a really interesting analysis of that. But it's especially in the Middle East, it's like individual striking images that tend to make a protest movement very global. We saw that, of course, in 2022 with the killing of Mahsa Amini and her graphic images of her all intubated in hospital after falling into a coma. We saw other images of brave women ripping off their hijabs and standing on top of cars and cutting their hair. And I think this is another image that has really sort of struck a chord among people, not just in Iran but worldwide.
I'm going to skip forward a bit and kind of get to the question that's on everyone's mind, because I think, interestingly, as you said, Iran is very much in a special state of turmoil right now, where the regime is coming out and saying that they're kind of out of solutions for these water and energy crises. They're designating days where heat and electricity is being shut off. There's talks about moving the capital since they simply can't sustain it economically. And the Bazari class, which had a huge part in the revolt in '79. So what people really want to know is this wave the final spark that will lead to the toppling of the regime?
I think it's very early to tell. And the regime is still a behemoth, is still very violent and dangerous. And while it doesn't necessarily have the capacity to respond to Israel or the United States in force, it does unfortunately have the capacity to brutalize and quell the people of Iran, who are much more defenseless. And just to touch on something that you said earlier, the regime actually hasn't tried to address the chronic water crisis seriously. It has been lingering for a lot of time, and the country's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, did mention that the country, Tehran, which is a megacity of 9-10 million people, is on the verge of running out of water. But at the same time, you saw a lot of regime officials not actually take this matter seriously, and instead blame Israel, for example, for moving the cloud and orchestrating a kind of cloud theft. And more recently, and equally egregiously, you saw other regime officials blame the women of Iran for being responsible for this water crisis, and saying it's God's punishment, the fact that women have been sort of increasingly and going in public with their hair uncovered, and also punishment to the government for not enforcing the dress code strictly enough. So, and I think the people of Iran are seeing this, that at a time when almost 5 of Tehran's major reservoirs that provide the city with drinking water at around 12% capacity, and some of the major lakes are essentially drying up. Instead of taking the matter seriously, they're sort of throwing these wild accusations, and they're also investing and allocating important resources not towards improving the lives of Iranian people and improving this ecological disaster, but they're sort of funneling more resources towards arming proxy groups. We saw in 2025 alone, Hezbollah reportedly receiving as much as $1 billion by the Islamic Republic. Um, and the people of Iran are noticing this, and that is definitely a factor that's going into them rising up and protesting, because they're protesting against a regime that doesn't care about them, is diverting important resources away from them being able to provide food, water, electricity to their families, and instead to exporting terror abroad. And it's of course it's a danger for an existential danger for Israel and a threat to the United States, but it's most of all an existential threat to the people of Iran, who deserve so much more. But in answer to your original question, um, we've seen many bouts over the past 46 years of Iranians rising up, and this is just the latest one. But we'll have to see how much more it sort of metastasizes, and who else joins in, and the extent to which it cripples the Islamic Republic before we can really talk about whether it's on the brink of collapse. Because we've seen many times people talk about how the regime is on the brink of collapse, and I think it sort of does it underestimates the power of the Islamic Republic, and I think it also can leads to the kind of complacency among, especially the international community, over the extent to which they should be supporting the people of Iran if they are told or under the assumption that the Islamic Republic is about to collapse. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. I want to touch back on historically when the Islamic regime took over. You know, you had the Bazari class, you had the Muslims who felt that they were oppressed, and you had, you know, a bunch of more secular people who kind of felt that they were being abandoned. So I wonder, the protest movement today, is it, what does it look like? Is it a unified front of everyone against the regime, or is it also still a mix of different like social factions that each have their own like grievances?
I think there are certainly interesting parallels. It's true that in '79, it was an extraordinary revolution in the fact that it was so broad based. It wasn't just supported by, religious fanatics who were supportive of the nascent Islamic Republic and the first, who eventually became the first supreme leader, Khomeini. You had broad support from the left and from the right, and people were mostly sort of united in their dissatisfaction with the status quo, and they had bought into this lie that this nascent government would bring about a brighter future. That was what they were promised, but of course that's not what ended up happening. And we saw a similar thing also in 2022, where I think one of the key successes of the Women Life Freedom Uprising was that there was so much support across 30 of Iran's 31 provinces. There were active protests being staged, and by people of all ages, genders, religious, ethnic backgrounds, socioeconomic rungs. At the moment, in Iran, we're seeing the protest movement being driven by sort of the sort of working class, the shopkeepers, but it's being other people are joining in. It's not exclusively being participated by them. So we're going to have to see who else takes part. But I think the vast majority of the people are absolutely united in what they are dissatisfied with, what they despise, and you could tell that by what they're chanting. They're united in their sort of dissatisfaction with the Islamic Republic, but it's not necessarily clear what if they're united in what should replace the Islamic Republic, because Iran's a massive country of 92 million people. Of course, many of them will have their own particular grievances, whether it's economic, whether it's social, whether it's political, whether it's a combination of the two. But you're seeing demonstrators chanting things like Azadi, which is freedom, Zan Zandagi Azadi, women life freedom. You're seeing reports of some people chanting for the return of the exiled crown prince. You're seeing other people chant for the death to the dictator. So I think there's referring to the supreme leader and the whole edifice that supports him. So it's there's definitely unity among what people don't want, but I don't know if there's unity over what should come next.
What is the kind of support that this broad protest movement needs from the international community in order to succeed, that either it's not getting or it needs more of? Like how can outside actors actually help?
I think in a number of ways. We're not talking about things like boots on the ground. What
No, no.
I'm referring to is a actively disassociating from the Islamic Republic, and there are still governments, in Western governments, that have some kind of relationship. And I think of the many Iranians that I spoke to when writing the book and just in general, that's, I think, the best kind of support that someone on the outside can exhibit when they're actively disassociating from the Islamic Republic and they're not aiding them in various ways. But also, if we're looking at the United Nations, where I work specifically, you know, let's look at the Human Rights Council. What are they doing to support the heroic people of Iran? Are they having any discussions around it? The answer at the moment is no. There are crickets. But that's in Geneva. So if we're talking about New York, the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, are there any urgent sessions being convened about the plight of the Iranian people and the future of the Islamic Republic? And the answer is, unfortunately, no, there's nothing. This week, as of the time of recording, the only real urgent Security Council session that was convened was around Israel's recognition of Somaliland, where you saw member states roundly, with the exception of the United States, roundly condemn Israel for making this sovereign decision, but absolute silence by other Security Council members and by the Secretary General around what's going on in Iran. And I think that's really appalling, and they deserve so much. And we saw, unfortunately, the same thing in 2022 and 2023, where there really was insufficient support for the people of Iran and essentially for other things going on in the world that don't necessarily directly concern Israel. There's so much focus and sort of obsessive, maniacal focus on Israel, and unfortunately I believe it comes at the expense of other very serious international developments, such as what's going on in Iran today. And it's really upsetting to see a real lack of focus and attention by the UN and by other international organizations at the moment on what's going on inside Iran.
So I want to ask about the regime itself. As you said earlier, there's kind of both a lack of response and mixed responses, where the president Pezeshkian is not really trying to solve it but addressing it, whereas other regime officials are shifting to other excuses and to other priorities. With the economic hardships and the droughts and this massive growing protest movement that they're sending their security forces to try to silence, what is the regime's priority right now?
I think their first priority is containment and also minimization of what's really happening. We saw almost immediately the President Pezeshkian tweet about the need for dialogue, but I think what gets forgotten about is that the fact that Iranians don't have access to Twitter. So, and also equally, the fact that Pezeshkian is the president of Iran, and his power and actual power and authority is extremely limited. Ultimate authority rests with the supreme leader. So in many cases, he's sort of the perfect sort of puppet figure to present an image of potential moderation, but that gets very quickly refuted, or the opposite thing actually happens behind the scenes. So we saw that when he started calling for the morality police to sort of be disbanded or for its scope to be reduced. But then almost immediately after, you would see someone in the supreme leader's inner circle say the exact opposite, and that's really what ended up happening. So I think the regime now is going to begin clamping down on the protesters. We'll see the extent to which they're successful, but you're also going to start to see probably a case of minimization and disinformation over exactly what's happening, which is why the sort of citizen journalism and the footage that we're getting by the people of Iran is so critical, because you can't really rely at all on the state-run media, and of course access to journalists there is severely limited. So sort of the netizen citizen journalism that you're getting is really absolutely critical to understanding what's really unfolding there.
Now, this might seem like conjecture and kind of a worst case scenario, but it's a big part of the rhetoric in Israel right now, given conversations around statements made by ministers and the Trump Netanyahu meeting about this potential rebuilding of the Iranian missile threat is, based off of what you know about Iran and historically and the situation, do you think Iran has an interest in renewing conflict with Israel and rebuilding its missiles, whether it be, based off the statements they said where they already feel threatened and they will respond, in par, or they want to distract from the protests? Like, is there a reality in which this spills over into, round two of the June war?
If you just take the statements of some of the officials alone, like I know we've spoken about Pezeshkian quite a lot, but just because he's made a lot of statements recently, he very recently said that Tehran or Iran is in a full scale war with not just Israel but with the United States and with Europe, and combine that with the fact that you've got recent intelligence pointing to the fact that the Islamic Republic is rebuilding much of its ballistic missile manufacturing facilities and is replenishing its arsenal. And these are very concerning, and it's definitely not in the interest of the Iranian people. The vast majority of them don't want this. They want to live in peace, harmony, prosperity. But unfortunately, they're being governed by a regime that, one of its foundational ideological pillars is the destruction of Israel and is the annihilation of the West and the United States. And unfortunately, those pillars haven't really shifted. And I think it would be very naive to assume that the Islamic Republic is rebuilding or reconstituting a nuclear weapons program or a ballistic missiles campaign for peaceful reasons. It's certainly not, and you may certainly begin to see a sort of attempt of distracting what's really happening domestically with this program of destruction, and that's definitely something that Israel is wary of and is monitoring, and it's certainly a concern. And President Trump was also absolutely clear that if they come to the conclusion that this is what the Islamic Republic is doing and is planning, then the United States won't hesitate either.
Obviously, time and time again, the United Nations has come up short when it comes to moral responsibilities and addressing these kinds of issues. But nevertheless, I'd love to ask you: Is Israel nevertheless trying to do something at the UN, either in terms of addressing the negligence of the regime or supporting these protest movements? Or is there anything active being done by Israel?
I think you'll start to see more because there's Israel has no enmity with the people of Iran. In fact, there's a history of peace, alliance, collaboration preceding 1979 under the Shah. But there's also thousands of years of amazing Jewish history and Jewish collaboration with Persians as well, with Iran. And that's why the talk of like Cyrus Accords and that, it's not something that's sort of unrealistic. It's sort of backed by precedent. So I think since no other countries at the most since the majority of UN member states aren't going to focus on what's happening inside Iran, then we'll do our best to raise awareness, and we have done before. There have been multiple statements and multiple attempts to raise awareness of what's happening inside Iran, and also to create a very clear distinction between the 92 million people inside Iran, the majority of whom want peace, and the 46-year-old Islamic Republic that wants anything but. And I think that's a very important distinction to make. And we'll continue to raise awareness about that fact.
What's the most important factor of, I would say, this ongoing protest movement, or how these are all connected, that maybe listeners don't necessarily know, but nevertheless you think is crucial that everyone should understand?
A few things that are important to look out for is just how long these protests stretch out, and how they sort of the grievances that are being sort of chanted are diversified and encapsulate all of the grievances of the people of Iran. So it's important to see just how long that stretches out. And it's also equally important to see sort of who and which of the governments in the international community actually step up and actually, stand in solidarity, not just in words, but in action with the people of Iran, because it was something that we saw also in 2022, where there was a huge wave of support and solidarity in the initial weeks or months of Mahsa Amini's killing, but then that fizzled out, and those statements of support weren't backed by meaningful, sustained action. So I think it'll be important to see what unfolds in the coming weeks and months and who actually steps up. Um, but that you'll see parallels between what's going on now and what happened in 2022, 2023, what happened in 2017 and 19, which were also predominantly economic protests, what happened in 2009, which was also known as the Green Revolution, following the disputed presidential re-election of Ahmadinejad, where many people saw that election as being completely rigged. You'll see parallels with the 1999 student protests. But I think something that is becoming increasingly apparent is, even though in the past 46 years you've seen wave and wave of protests that hasn't quite sort of been successful in overthrowing the government, you're seeing that these massive protests are happening in a shorter space of time with much greater frequency, and massive intensity. And I think it's, the Islamic Republic can only sustain so much. So we'll have to see what happens in the coming future.
Absolutely. This new wave is really fresh, and we have to, we'll wait and see what happens. I think you also mentioned this earlier about there isn't much of a focus on, the day after the regime. So I guess the question that I would pose to you is, what is being done or should be done, I would say, to make sure that, if the regime eventually does, get toppled by the intensity of these protests, that the thing that replaces it isn't something just as bad, if not worse.
That's always a very important consideration, because a void left long enough after any kind of transformation can be very serious and could lead to worse outcomes. But I think ultimately the future of Iran has to be decided by the people inside Iran, and I hope soon you or someone else from the Jerusalem Post will be able to have someone inside Iran on your podcast, or a group of people on your podcast, where you can have this very conversation and they can talk about, what kinds of plans they have in mind, and what kind of system of government they would want. But it's definitely not for us to decide. It's for the people inside Iran to decide and dictate their own future. And I think our role is to support them in their multi-decade quest for freedom.
Absolutely. And a while ago I thought that, it would be completely unrealistic that something like that would even happen, but now it feels more within our reach that we could actually have someone like that on our podcast. And I would love to hear what they have to say. So again, we do have to see how this develops. I'm sure it's safe to say that the next few days, won't go by quietly, and we'll have to take it to, from there and continue to support. But I wanted to thank you so much for joining us and for giving your insights.
Thank you so much for having me and for covering this.
Before moving on, there's a lot of news that happened this week that we simply can't ignore. Here to talk about it, we're joined by our very own breaking news editor, Lara Sukster Mosheyof. Lara, let's talk about the news.
For sure.
Obviously, top story was all over our site last week, but everybody's really talking about the meeting between Netanyahu and Trump at Mar-a-Lago, Florida. This is, I believe, the 6th time they've met. So naturally, everyone was curious to see what would come out of it. They discussed a lot of things. They discussed the Gaza ceasefire. They discussed Iran. They made some comments about potential Netanyahu pardon. So what were your thoughts on it?
I would say that if we considered everything that happened in Gaza with the hostages and all the international scandals and talks that we had, I really do believe that this meeting makes us seeing that really for this time we are caring about what happened, and mostly I think that internationally we are putting a lot of thought on solving this like it's not even possible to solve something that already happened, but we are preventing it from happening again in some way.
I think with these kinds of meetings, there's always, I like to think of it as like there's two meetings. There's what we see in public, and then there's what goes on behind closed doors. And it's not that one is more important than the other. I think they're both very valid and legitimate. I always try to pay attention to both. So in public, I think it's very important, and it really says a lot that Israel is the country that is collaborating so closely with the United States to the point that our prime minister visits so many times, and every meeting they have brings results. So there already is like the show of this camaraderie, which is a huge deal, and it really cuts a lot of like the middlemen and other mediators, and it allows us to have direct, well-intentioned talks. And it's especially important given all the talks about the next phase of the ceasefire and who's going to be on this international force and the Board of Peace. Our reporters have spoke about how Israel is really trying to keep countries like Turkey excluded. So the continued collaboration is definitely very important, and it's very it's reassuring to see. And definitely every time that Netanyahu goes to the United States and visits, I think it's like a step in the right direction. That being said, I'm also they say when one door closes, another opens. Mm-hmm. So the environment kind of feels like all hands on deck are committed to really seeing an end to the war in Gaza, and I think that's incredible. That being said, me personally, this isn't a consensus. This isn't the J-Post's opinion, but I am starting to get a little worried about all the talk about Iran again, because historically, that's just how this plays out. We talk about a threat, we do something about the threat, and then it's quiet for anywhere between a few months to a few years. So, when there's the June war, we thought like, oh, okay, we wiped out the threat. We said we wiped out the threat, right? We declared a huge victory over Iran, and we managed to snub the threat. So if there legitimately is this rebuilding of a ballistic missile program, my main concerns are, one, this is going to lead to another round of violence, which was not fun for anybody here, how rough it was. But two, it just the fact that it's in this conversation again, and it's like part of the public discussion, kind of casts doubt for me about our capabilities to actually snub the threat for good.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I also think that regarding international law, for example, the fact that this meeting is happening right now and that people are finally talking about it, and we think about the Iran threat and everything, it's a very big step on international law and in international collaboration regarding wars and regarding the situation in Israel, because usually there is something inside international law that is international collaboration. It's one of the aspects, and it's not always works, and it's not always implied. So I think that because of this time, this is really happening. It is a first step to a future improvement.
Yeah, no, it's definitely great that that Israel is showing the willingness to continue to collaborate and cooperate.
Regarding Romi Gonen and her abuse during Hamas captivity, it was also something that we were talking about this week, and something that we've been talking about in a long way until this moment, because she was not the only one.
Right.
We have another hostages like Ron Breslavsik, for example, and Guy Gilboa Delal that also talked about their situations of abuse in captivity.
Listen, I have a lot of thoughts about it. Obviously, it reawakens basically our deepest fears and sorrows from October 7th. It's like this kind of reality that we've kind of tried to reconcile with and forget and move on, but there's a reminder that this is actually just the world that we live in. I'm obviously not gonna go into the details of the article and what she said. It's on our website. There's a disclaimer if people want to read it, if they feel comfortable. I highly recommend that they do. What I will say is, first and foremost, I'm glad that she did it. She's very brave for doing it. It's not an easy thing to do.
100%.
And given just the sheer denials and disregard for these accounts and testimonies from international organizations, from the UN, etc., So anytime a hostage who suffered this kind of abuse, that they come out and say, and you know, they muster up the courage to do this, I really have like nothing but the utmost respect for them, because I think it's just so important. I think it's something that only they can do, really. It really is just also incredible to see their resilience, because I remember when Romi Gonen was released and then she had to undergo like a surgery. So she's been in the news, a few times, and, we've covered every single time. So we've seen her throughout the months since her release, and she looks like, this very happy-go-lucky person. Looks like she's really recovering well, and, she seems like she's really managing it compared to other hostages that we've seen have released. So the fact that she's been able to, carry this weight with her and still have like the willpower to move on, I think is really nothing short of incredible. And again, I just really like nothing but the utmost respect for her for being able to tell this like really, really important story. And while I am doubtful, I always hope that every time something like, this comes out in the news, I hope this will be the incident that makes organizations actually listen and do something about it, and not just pretend that it didn't happen, because there's enough.
For sure. And I think that the fact that this time the hostages are really talking about what happened makes all the denial that happened to be shaded. And that's exactly what we need right now. Because if we think like never forget and always remember, it's not about being greedy about that all the time and being sad, but to talk about it so it won't happen again.
Right. And again, obviously there are also hostages who suffered this and haven't come forward, and I completely understand it, and that's absolutely their right and the prerogative. But yeah, I absolutely feel like also like us as a newspaper, we have like a duty that when, these come out, to really amplify it, to make sure that it is heard, because they, in a world where people are denying essentially what was, broadcast and videotaped, like it just has to be, shouted out until everyone can hear it. Moving on to something more international, there was an interesting week this week in England. The British government repatriated a prisoner from Egypt, Ala Abd al-Fattah, who is a controversial activist who has made some not so great comments in the past. These also including, but not limited to, calling for the killing of Zionists and the whites, as he put it. So that in of itself was one part of the story, and then the other part of the story is the kind of money that they held to receive him, where, Keir Starmer said they were very happy to receive him, and he thanked CC for the pardon. Now, obviously, there's a lot of backlash because of, again, the release of this, this hateful, controversial activist, and B, the spectacle that was kind of put around it. I don't know. It's really hard to put a finger on exact, because there's a lot of elements here. I think the whole spectacle around it was more controversial than the release itself. It's very confusing, because, to his credit, he did kind of half apologize for his comments, saying they were, the frustrations of a young, frustrated man or something like that, which doesn't necessarily excuse it, but like, compared to other activists who we've seen who've been released who absolutely don't backtrack on anything that they say, at the very least he realizes that like it doesn't look the best. I would have preferred if, the UK's government themselves expressed a little, something about these comments and not just swept it under the rug and made it about the family reunion. So I'm not giving him this whole credit. I'm not saying it's completely excused. I don't know. It feels almost like satirical at this point, just the amount of like pomp and circumstance that was put around it.
100%. And also, if we think about how UK received the situation, it doesn't seem like they really checked about his past and everything that he did, and if he was deserving of coming back to the country and being established as someone that never did a thing. And I don't know, I believe that sometimes international politics is closing their eyes to very important situations like this one, and we can never decide not to consider all the points involved when we take a prisoner back to a country.
Right.
Because this may be very dangerous for the population, and it's something to think about it 100%. So coming back to Israel, let's talk about the Iron Beam launch that happened this week. And for the ones who don't know, the Iron Beam is a laser system that destroys the threats before they get to the country and before they get to the radar. So something that is very interesting about the Iron Beam is that sometimes it can even intercept faster and we won't even listen to sirens.
Right.
Something that is amazing because also after everything that we passed through these 2 years, going to bomb shelters all the time, if we had the chance to have the threats intercepted before it happens, it would be a relief for the society.
This launch wasn't a surprise. They announced this way back when, I think in June or something. They said the deadline was like December 30th, and they announced all these successful field tests. But it is, it really is nothing short of spectacular. As you said, that being able to intercept rockets or missiles so early that they don't even have to activate a siren and people don't have to run to their shelters is in and of itself an incredible achievement. There's a lot of other difficulties with the current missile interceptor systems that this kind of solves that issue. For example, during the war with Iran, we saw that if a lot of missiles were launched, the interceptors kind of got confused and rerouted and either missed or just kind of like completely went back and like hit the ground in Israel because the radar system was like confused, whereas the laser is just a laser. It just shoots straight, so that's not going to happen. This issue of munitions isn't an issue. So after the war with Iran, there was this concern that we don't have enough ballistic missile interceptors because the systems are different than Iron Dome. They need a more substantial interceptor, and we had help from the U.S.'s THAAD system, and even that, a lot of the reserves are depleted. So there's this question of will we be ready for the next conflict? So the Iron Beam is a laser used with light, so this issue of literal munitions to intercept is no longer a problem. Obviously, I'm not going to come out here and say that now this defense is hermetic and 100% and nothing can ever get through, because that's simply not true. And Israel's greatest defense is really it's like the multitude of different ways that it defends itself. There's layers, so that there's the Iron Beam and the Iron Dome and the Arrow 3 and the sirens and the bomb shelters. And when you put all these layers together, that's essentially what keeps people safe. But that shouldn't underplay the incredible development which is this laser. We thought who knows what would have happened if this was ready on October 7th. Who knows what would have happened if this was ready
Of course.
in the war with Iran, or when things like heat up with Hezbollah. So I obviously we can't look back in the past and say it's a shame that it wasn't ready, but the fact that it is now really means that we can confidently say that Israel's borders are definitely 100% safer now.
Yeah, and not only that, I think that we can also mention the price of it, because with the Iron Beam, we are essentially spending less money on war, because the interception with the old system, it's more expensive.
It's very expensive.
It's very expensive. And also, if we think about our economy and what happened with the economy with all these 2 years of war, it really helps us to see a bright future if this happens again. We hopefully we won't have another war. It is our dream, but we don't know what's going to happen. So at least we know that now we can only feel safer, but also we know that our economy is going to be more protected, and that's a very good advancement.
For sure. So yeah, I guess those were the top headlines of the week. So thank you so much for joining us. And now for something a little different, we're joined by recently released IDF soldier Eyal Zakai for some perspective on the last 2 years of war and readjusting to life outside of Gaza. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So first, why don't you introduce yourself? Let us know who you are, what you're doing here, why we brought you in.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Eyal Zakai. Basically, I made Aliyah from New York to Israel when I was 2 years old with my family.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I pretty much grew up here. And I grew up in a musical family. I've been performing in all kinds of shows and kassim my whole life, since I'm 5 years old, I think. And my whole family's musical, and especially my brother, who's older than me, Alicia.
Mm-hmm.
And when he was around 12, basically he decided he wanted to start releasing musical covers to YouTube. And that's when he started learning how to record, learning how to film, all that on YouTube. And that's how he just continued, getting better and better than that. And then eventually he kind of brought me in on that. And we were just releasing, covers onto YouTube, having fun with it. Everything was very homemade. We were filming music videos in like every single possible bedroom in our house, recording in the living room in our bedrooms, until I think I was in 11th grade. We decided I was meantime on the side writing some original music, and we decided we really wanted to take this music thing seriously. And then so we started releasing original music, and we started performing concerts both in Israel and in the States, all over. And we kind of were just working on that for a while until eventually I got to the point in my life where I had to draft, and then
as do we all.
We all do, yeah. and that's when I realized, a combat service would really mean I'd have to take a break from the whole progression in the music career. It was quite the dilemma. On one hand I had this career I was building, and I also felt like I had a lot of meaning in it because I was really trying to spread positive messages, and I was like on one of my concerts in America was a concert about Zionism and trying to push the whole the whole Israel concept to Americans, and I felt like I had a lot of meaning also in the music career, and at the end I couldn't be happier about my combat career, my combat service in the Army, both what it did for me as just as an individual, and also just I don't know, like taking part in like such a crucial part, like time in Jewish history, just felt like a massive privilege. I was just talking about it with my dad last night, how, I feel like when you speak about Jewish history, you hear about all kinds of different chapters and stuff. Like when we think about, I don't know, the Holocaust, like the Jews experienced the Holocaust, or some sort of war, like the Jews experienced the war. Right. And then also when it happens to us, you kind of realize that like everybody's going to be experiencing it from different points of view, from different, wherever they are, whether it's age or location or whatever it is. And I just feel super privileged that I was able to experience it, on the front lines and in such a meaningful way. And I just feel like, I just feel very, very fortunate to have been where I've been.
So I'm assuming that you've spent a decent amount of time in Gaza over the past
year.
Yeah. So remind me, where did you end up drafting? What unit?
So I was drafted to the Kfir Brigade.
Kfir, okay.
Which they made quite the name for themselves this war. Did a lot of great work, and very happy about it.
It was interesting because I think Kfir usually, if I'm not mistaken, is usually over in the West Bank, not usually in Gaza, and I think the deployments in Gaza it wasn't the first, but it was like the first in a very long time.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think historically, like they may have had more of like they were more of a West Bank kind of unit, but for sure since the war they've been really everywhere. They've been up north and in Gaza, currently they're both in Gaza and in the West Bank.
All right, so tell me a little bit about that. Like obviously you don't have to go over everything you experienced, but this perspective that you're talking about now about this chapter in history, is it easy to keep in mind when you're in Gaza on the front lines? Does sometimes kind of get lost because of the difficulty? Like how, take us through it. What does it feel like?
It's a great question. It's very, very accurate that, ideally, like you have like all kinds of these values and morals, and everyone on the outside gets to see like all the headlines of, all the meaning and all the more attractive headlines, we'll call it. And at the end of the day, when you're in there in Gaza, you just got to deal with, being there.
Yeah.
I think people like, whether it's from movies or from just the stories they hear, I think people like think Gaza, like they imagine you're in like the foxhole all day with bullets flying over your head. And that's definitely, like the missions and the war aspect is definitely like a difficulty there. But I think a difficulty that like, that isn't so spoken about is like the fact that, people you're just there, and you got to live in that reality of being in Gaza, and
there's a lot of downtime the other 15 hours of the day,
100%, whether it's not showering for like a month or two at a time, or people have done more. I can't say I hold like the record for no showering, but I'm trying to contend.
I don't even want to know what
So whether it's not showering or living on top of each other, and there's also like the disconnect. I feel like people don't realize, like when you're in Gaza months at a time, like usually most people don't have phones,
right?
I don't have any connection to the outside world, and obviously can't leave. And you go in for amounts of time that you go in, you're not sure for how long you're going to be going in for. Like I remember actually like when we were in northern Gaza in the beginning, like a few months back, so basically like we had no phones obviously, and our commander had like one phone for the 30 of us.
Yeah.
And like, once every 1 or 2 days, like he tells us like headlines, kind of like tries to keep us kind of in the loop to know what's going on in the world. And like we were just one day, just out of the blue, randomly was like, oh yeah, so by the way, like Syria is not a country anymore. All of a sudden you find out that doesn't exist.
Assad fled.
Yeah, exactly. Like all kinds of these crazy stuff. Or we went into Gaza before the Iran war ever happened.
Right.
And by the time we came out of Gaza, the war was already over. Right. Like the world's just changing. Like all around us. And it's crazy.
Insane. So to tie that back into your career, obviously, you've talked about how this dilemma where you have to put your, you have to put your music on hold. But do you think has anything from this experience kind of come with you that you've taken either for inspiration or lessons that have attributed to your music today?
For sure. I mean, there's all kinds. Like again, both just like, when I write, it comes from like like hard and strong emotions that I'm feeling, and just everything about the army experience really helps you learn things about yourself and learn things about just new perspectives and looking at the world.
For sure.
And I mean, the one thing that obviously comes to mind is a song I wrote in Gaza while I was in Gaza for my friend Zamir Burke. Basically what happened was we were in Gaza, and then we found out that Zamir Burke, my friend, who I grew up with him, like we were in school together from first grade till 12th grade, and we were a few classmates actually, like all together in the same machlaka, like within the same 30 guys, and we found out, so Zamir wasn't with us. We were in the Kfir Brigade, and he was in Handasa, and we found out that he got killed like 1.5 kilometers away from us.
Wow.
And we did everything we could to try to get out for the funeral, and like it just wasn't so possible at that point. And we tried to even get out for the shiva, and they said we couldn't. And basically we were just left there in Gaza, and we actually had a guitar. And over there, that's when I started writing this song called in Hebrew, "Sheket Shachar Sarah," in the quiet after the storm. And I've definitely learned a lot, and just it meant a lot that I was able to dedicate that song for him.
Wow. Well, first of all, I'm very sorry, to hear that and sorry for your loss. Wow. I can't even imagine. I think not being able, like, to get out and really just kind of like internalize what happened. Like, did it hit you right away, or was this disconnect still, like, because like sometimes when I was in the army, like only once I got home and like took my shoes off, I actually, like, it hit me that things happened, and you're like really in it. So like, what were those moments like for you, either when you found out or like also when you were like writing the song?
So for sure. So I mean, there's definitely the aspect of you can't really you can't afford to take time to but I have to say, like, writing the song has definitely helped me get through it. And also I just feel like the song was written for him, and it was dedicated for him, but just as much as it was dedicated for him, I wanted to dedicate it to his family and his incredible family. When we eventually got out of the army, when we eventually got out of Gaza, because we missed the shiva, so we went and sat down with his mom and his sister, and his grandmother was there. No, his grandmother was there later, but we were just talking to them, and being able to speak to them about it. And then eventually, when I finished writing the song, which took me some time to really complete the song, when I was able to play it for his mom and grandmother, it was a super meaningful, and I was just happy. I was hoping, listen, I don't know, like, obviously we can never understand the kind of loss that they face, but if I was able to just give them, just a little bit of some sort of condolence to this incredible loss that they had to go through, then I'm happy I can try to help just a bit.
So another interesting element is I'm sure you're obviously excited, to go back to regular civilian life, but there's a lot of discussion over the past 2 years about the day after and what it looks like, and a lot of people who've already been released have hard times, adjusting to civilian life because of, A, the hardships they faced, and B, just the sheer expanse of time and how long it's been dragging on. So, a question I would pose to you that I kind of pose to really everybody, like myself included, because no one's really entirely sure, but do you even feel prepared for like the day after? Like, do you feel ready to almost move on to like a reality where the war in Gaza isn't like the norm anymore?
Yeah, so I mean, I could speak, about myself. I mean, I'm sure there's, many people, unfortunately, who have experienced, I'm sure a lot more traumatic things during their service. But I mean, just as far as what I've experienced, I mean, I can tell you like what they tell us, and they have like every once in a while they have like a mental health session in the army. And like what they tell us is like, the one line that they repeat is "Zar lo yavin," meaning a stranger can never understand. And what they're trying to tell us is that we could speak to other people about it. At the end of the day, we have each other, and we know each one of us, meaning within our squad or whatever it is, we know only we know what each other have experienced. And thank God I'm fortunate to be learning yeshiva now with all the guys I was in the army. I'm doing Hesder, which is you go to yeshiva, and the guys who are with yeshiva, you go to the army, and the same group of guys were back in yeshiva, and I just we're just together still, from before the army. Tons of them are my childhood friends. Like I was with them from elementary school, so we're just going through it together, and I see, again, also for me the path is very much paved, since I have this Hesder path of going from the army and back to yeshiva, and and I have all kinds of stuff I'm trying to work on, like the music, and I see how people with a less paved path can definitely face a lot more of a challenge. So I just feel very fortunate to still be with my friends, with the great guys I served with, and in a great place, thank God.
Yeah, it sounds like you have a great network.
Yeah, thank God, it's good guys.
Kind of going back to what I said earlier, how we're in the ceasefire, and it looks like we all want to move forward, and we have like these few things to kick out. One of the more notable things that have happened recently is that Hamas put out this kind of manifesto. They revealed a new spokesman, made all these statements, et cetera, et cetera. I already wrote. I spoke extensively about how I think it's a bunch of just showmanship and not really achieving anything. But as someone who has to kind of be on the front lines when they're called up, I would just love to hear your perspective on like what do you and your friends and like people in your squadron, like how does this feel when you see them like rear their heads up again? Not that I think it's like the end of the world here, that's like this big threat that we need to freak out, but like
Yeah, so I think it's funny, like a lot of people like I'm as a soldier, I'm sure you've experienced this too, like I feel like a lot of people like ask, like as a soldier, like they come up to you and ask you like all kinds of questions as if we know any more about the topic, which we usually probably know less, just because everyone else like outside is like glued to the news and like know what's going on. We're like super yeah, exactly, we're super disconnected. but just when we're inside, we're trained like to never let our guards down, and we're our job is just to show that we're there, and we're there to protect, and if they try anything, we're going to be on top of it, and we're just there to protect anybody, near any borders of any sort. And, and it doesn't matter if they're, supposedly bringing their heads up, or if they're quiet. Like, we never trust their silence. We never let our guard down for a second, even when they're supposedly silent.
Right.
And yeah, from what I know, just the Army's just, we're always ready to go, no matter what kind of talk is on them. And the second they want to start something, we'll be there. But also, I think what a lot of people don't notice or realize is that even when the Army is supposedly just on the defensive, like the defensive includes a lot of offense.
Right, especially in the middle of a ceasefire.
Exactly, yeah. Meaning the Army knows how to make sure Hamas is keeping their heads down, even when supposedly just on defense. Defense includes a lot of offense. That's how war works. So I think that is definitely is a part of just the whole defense tactic of the Army.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that you're still on top of it.
Yeah, well.
You're sharing. All right, well, it's truly been incredible.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
No, really, thank you so much for joining us.
I really appreciate it.
Where can we find the song?
Yeah, so the song right now is on all platforms: YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, and yeah, thank God, hopefully it can give whoever listens to it a little bit of hope, a little bit of strength, and the song that we're releasing soon, hopefully that too, and we're just looking forward to really spreading good messages with our music.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining us. That's all we have for this episode. We'll be back in the same place next week. Until then, make sure to visit jpost.com to stay up to date on Israel and the Jewish world.